The Howth Lighthouse keeper's Gulls, 1874 Seabirds, refused to land for weeks. Body found in lamp room. March 17, 1874. Howth Peninsula, County Dublin, Ireland. Harbour Master William Hutchins climbs the 111 steps of Howth Lighthouse for the third time in as many days. The lamp has been burning irregularly. Ships have complained. But that's not what troubles him most. It's the gulls. For 23 days, the seabirds that normally crowd every surface of the lighthouse have refused to land. They circle, they scream. But they will not touch the tower. Hutchins reaches the lamp room door. It's locked from the inside. He calls out for Thomas Wickham, the keeper. No answer. Just that smell, thick, sweet, unmistakable. When they finally break through, Hutchins sees the body slumped beneath the great lamp. But it's what's arranged around Thomas Wickham's corpse that makes the harbor master vomit on the spiral stairs. The official report would call it an accident, a tragic fall while maintaining the light. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone dared to document. Before we uncover the truth about the Howth Lighthouse tragedy, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now, let's step back to 1874 and discover what really happened on that isolated tower on the Irish coast. Ireland in 1874 existed in the shadow of famine and exodus. The Great Hunger of the 1840s had hollowed out the countryside, leaving ghost villages and a population that had shrunk by nearly a quarter. Those who remained lived with a peculiar duality. They were British subjects who would never be quite British enough, Catholics in a Protestant empire, survivors bearing the genetic memory of starvation. The Howth Peninsula jutted into the Irish Sea like an accusation, a rocky finger pointing toward England across the water. The village of Howth itself clung to the harbor, a fishing community of perhaps 800 souls who made their living from the gray churning waters. The men worked the boats. The women mended nets and smoked fish. Children grew up with salt in their blood, and an understanding that the sea gave and the sea took away. The lighthouse had stood at Howth's eastern point since 1818, a white tower rising 82 feet above the cliffs. Its lamp, a first-order Fresnel lens imported from France, could be seen for 17 nautical miles on a clear night. In fog or storm, it was the difference between safe harbor and widows. Thomas Wickham had kept that light for 11 years. He was 43 years old in the winter of 1874, a man whose face had been carved lean by wind and whose hands bore the permanent stains of lamp oil. Before the lighthouse, he'd worked the fishing boats, but an accident with a gaff hook had left his left hand partially crippled, 3 fingers that no longer bent properly. The lighthouse service had been his salvation, a position that paid £32 annually and came with a cottage at the tower's base. He lived alone. His wife Catherine had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, along with the infant son who might have carried his name. Wickham had no other family that anyone knew of. He was quiet, reliable, perhaps a bit too fond of his evening whiskey, but who could blame him? Lighthouse keeping was lonely work, or so everyone thought. What they didn't know, what wouldn't emerge until much later, was that Thomas Wickham had not been alone at all. The first sign that something was wrong came in late January 1874. Mrs. Eleanor Byrne, who sold eggs and butter to the lighthouse keeper, noticed that Wickham had stopped coming to the village for his weekly provisions. This in itself wasn't alarming. Winter storms often made the cliff path treacherous, but when she ventured up to the lighthouse with her nephew to deliver supplies, she found something peculiar. The door to the keeper's cottage stood open. Inside, the fire had gone cold. Wickham's bed hadn't been slept in for what looked like several days. But the lighthouse itself was functioning perfectly. The lamp burned with mathematical precision. The lens was clean. The logbook was current. When she finally found Wickham, he was in the lamp room, and he seemed strange. He startled when she called up to him, as if he'd forgotten anyone else existed in the world. His clothes were rumpled, and there were what looked like scratch marks on his neck. "Are you well, Mr. Wickham?" she'd asked. "Perfectly well, Mrs. Byrne. Never better. The light must be kept, you understand. The light must always be kept." She left the provisions and departed, troubled by something she couldn't quite name, the way his eyes had darted to the lamp room door behind him, as if checking that it remained closed. The faint smell she'd caught on the wind, something organic and wrong. But she said nothing. In a village like Howth, you learn not to pry into other people's strangeness, escalating incidents. February brought storms that hammered the coast with 40-foot waves and winds that stripped tiles from roofs. The lighthouse stood fast, its lamp cutting through the chaos with unwavering precision. But the village began to notice other things. Patrick Sullivan, who fished lobster pots near the lighthouse point, swore he heard screaming one night during a lull in the weather. Not the wind, actual human screaming coming from the tower. He'd told his wife, who'd told Father Brennan, who'd mentioned it to Harbor Master Hutchins, who'd made a note to check on Wickham when the weather cleared. But the weather didn't clear. February became a month of continuous gray, of rain that fell sideways and cold that penetrated bone. The lighthouse stood isolated, approachable only by the most desperate or determined. When Hutchins finally made it up to the tower on February 28th, he found Wickham in a state that alarmed him. The keeper had lost weight, his cheekbones jutted sharp, and his hands trembled constantly. More concerning were his eyes, which held a fevered quality that Hutchins associated with brain fever or strong drink. "Thomas, man, when did you last eat a proper meal?" Wickham had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I eat when I remember to eat. The light doesn't care about meals, William. The light only cares about burning. You need to come down to the village, get Mrs. Byrne to make you something substantial. This isolation is—" "I'm not isolated." Wickham had said this quickly, sharply, then softer. I have my duties." The keeper answered the cottage door, after several minutes of knocking. He was barefoot despite the cold, wearing only a shirt and trousers that looked as if they'd been slept in for weeks. The scratch marks on his neck had multiplied, joined by what looked like bite marks on his forearms. "Mr. Wickham, I'm here at the harbor master's request. He's concerned for your health." "My health is excellent. The light burns well, the lens is clean, the log is current. What more could be asked of a keeper? May I come in, examine you properly?" Wickham had hesitated, and in that hesitation, Dr. Morrison caught a glimpse of something behind the keeper's eyes. Not fever, not madness, but fear. Pure, animal fear. "The cottage is untidy, not fit for receiving. I'm a doctor, Mr. Wickham, I've seen untidy." But Wickham had blocked the doorway with his body. "I must ask you to leave. The light requires attention. The lamp room calls." Dr. Morrison would later testify that this phrase, "the lamp room calls," had been delivered with a quality he could only describe as religious fervor, as if Wickham were speaking of God himself. The doctor had attempted to reason with the keeper, to explain that his appearance suggested severe malnutrition and possible infection from the wounds on his arms and neck. But Wickham had simply closed the door, leaving Morrison standing on the threshold. As the doctor descended the cliff path, he'd looked back at the tower. Every window was dark except the lamp room itself, which glowed with its usual steady light. But Dr. Morrison could have sworn he saw movement in one of the lower windows, a shadow that didn't match the keeper's thin frame, something larger and lower to the ground. He'd blinked, and it was gone. That evening he wrote a letter to the Board of Irish Lights recommending Wickham's immediate removal and replacement. The letter would arrive in Dublin on March 16th. By then it would be far too late. The final incident before the discovery came on the night of March 15th. A fishing boat, returning late to harbor, delayed by a torn net and falling tide, passed close to the lighthouse point. There were 3 men aboard, Michael O'Malley, his son James, and a deckhand named Seamus Walsh. All 3 would later give the same account, with a consistency that troubled the investigators. They'd been perhaps 200 yards from the lighthouse when they heard the sound. It started as a low moan, rising in pitch and volume until it became a howl, a sound of such desperate anguish that James O'Malley had crossed himself. It was something else, a sound like an animal in pain, or a person trying to imitate an animal, or something that was neither one nor the other. The lamp had flickered, just once, but unmistakably. In 11 years, Thomas Wickham's lamp had never flickered. "Row faster," Michael O'Malley had told his son. "Row like the devil himself is behind us." They'd reached the harbor and tied up in record time. O'Malley had gone directly to the harbor master's house and pounded on the door until Hutchins appeared, nightshirt and confusion. "Something's wrong at the lighthouse, William. Something's very wrong. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more forgotten mysteries like this one. Share this with someone who loves dark history. Now let's discover what happened when they finally broke into that lamp room. March 17th, 1874. St. Patrick's Day, a day when most of Ireland paused for celebration, for prayer, for the wearing of shamrocks and the remembrance of saints. William Hutchins had no time for saints. He'd assembled a small party, Dr. Morrison, Constable Richard Doyle, and 2 strong men from the village, Patrick Sullivan and Michael O'Malley himself. They'd climbed the cliff path at first light, the morning fog still thick enough to taste. The cottage door stood open. The interior was worse than Dr. Morrison had glimpsed before. Furniture overturned, broken dishes, and on the walls, scratch marks. Deep gouges in the plaster, running in sets of 4 parallel lines. Some were at shoulder height. Some were much lower near the floor. Some appeared to have been made by human nails. Others did not, but no keeper. "The tower," Hutchins said. His voice sounded hollow in the fog. They entered the lighthouse base. The smell hit them immediately, that sweet, organic rot that speaks of decay and worse things. The stone walls seemed to absorb the stench, holding it close like a secret. The spiral stairs climbed into darkness. Their lanterns pushed back the shadows but couldn't eliminate them. As they ascended, Constable Doyle noticed something on the steps. Dark stains, not recent, dried to a brown crust, but extensive. They led upward, accompanied by smears on the wall where something had brushed against the stone. "Blood," Dr. Morrison said quietly. "Several days old, a significant amount." They continued climbing, the smell intensified. At the 3rd landing, Michael O'Malley gagged and had to stop, pressing his face against the cold stone to steady himself. The lamp room door was locked. Hutchins called out, "Thomas! Thomas Wickham, open this door!" Silence. Just the sound of their breathing and the distant cry of gulls that still refused to approach. Hutchins hammered on the door with his fist. "Wickham, this is the harbor master. Open immediately." Nothing. "Break it down," Hutchins ordered. It took Patrick Sullivan and Michael O'Malley 3 attempts. The door was solid oak, built to withstand coastal storms. When it finally gave way, splintering around the lock, the smell that rushed out was so intense that Sullivan stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. Hutchins entered first, lantern held high. The lamp room was a circular space, perhaps 15 feet in diameter. The great Fresnel lens dominated the center, its prismatic glass catching and multiplying the lantern light into 1,000 fractured beams. The lamp itself still burned, though the oil reservoir was nearly empty, perhaps another hour before it would have gone dark. Thomas Wickham lay beneath the lamp. He was on his back, eyes open, mouth frozen in what might have been a scream or a prayer. His clothing was torn, and his body bore wounds that Dr. Morrison would later catalog, with clinical precision: 37 distinct bite marks, 23 deep scratches, and a partially severed left ear. His crippled hand had been mutilated further, the damaged fingers stripped of flesh down to the bone. But these injuries, horrific as they were, had not killed him. The cause of death was apparent even to the untrained eye. His throat had been torn open, not cut, but torn, as if by teeth or claws, with such force that the vertebrae were visible. Dr. Morrison knelt beside the body, forcing himself into professional detachment. Deceased approximately 3 to 4 days. Significant blood loss. Attack appears to have been sustained. Multiple wounds inflicted over time, not all at once. Constable Doyle was staring not at the body but at the walls. Dear God in heaven. The interior surface of the lamp room had been covered in writing, scratched into the paint with something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a piece of broken glass. The words ran together without punctuation, spiraling around the room in a maddened script. "The light calls, the light must burn. She came up from the water, she said she was cold. I let her in. I let her in. God forgive me, I let her in. She is not what she seems. She is not human. She is hungry, always hungry. The light attracts them. The light calls them up from the deep places. I cannot make her leave. She will not leave the tower. She says the light is hers. Now she says I must feed the light. I must feed her. I cannot, I will not. She is in my dreams. She is in my blood. She crawls through the walls at night. I hear her in the service room. I hear her breathing. I am so tired, so hungry. She drinks and drinks, and I am empty. I am hollow. I will end this. I will, I must. The light must burn, the ships must see. God help me. God help us all. She is coming up the stairs, she is. The message ended mid-sentence, the final letters trailing off into meaningless scratches. What in Christ's name is this? Sullivan whispered. What happened to him? Hutchins moved slowly around the room, lantern illuminating each section of wall. The writing covered every available surface, growing smaller and more frantic toward the end. But it was what he found behind the lamp mechanism that made him call for the others. Tucked into the narrow space between the lens assembly and the outer wall was a makeshift nest of sorts. Blankets and clothing had been wadded together, surrounding a collection of items that spoke to extended habitation: empty whiskey bottles, gnawed bones from what might have been fish or seabirds, and a leather journal. Dr. Morrison retrieved the journal carefully, as if it might bite. The cover was stained with something dark and oily. Inside, the pages contained Wickham's daily logs, standard lighthouse keeper entries recording weather, ship sightings, and lamp maintenance. Until January 27th, that entry read, "Found woman on rocks below tower. Storm had driven her ashore. Brought her to cottage to warm by fire. Says her ship went down in the gale. No other survivors. Irish speaker, limited English. Name sounds like Murian or Morin. Will report to harbor master when weather permits. January 28th M. Still recovering. Appears unharmed by ordeal. Appetite substantial. Has consumed entire week's provisions. Odd habits. Refuses to fully enter cottage. Prefers to stay near doorway. Will not tolerate firelight. Eyes sensitive. Storm continues. January 30th M. Growing stronger. Too strong. She moves with unusual speed. Caught her in the lamp room last night staring at the lens. Says the light calls to her, that she can hear it singing. Asked her to stay in cottage. She smiled. Her teeth are very white. The entries became more disjointed after that. February brought fragmentary notes. Cannot sleep. She is always watching. Found her in the service room. She had killed a gull. She was eating it raw. She says she is hungry. Always hungry. I give her food, but it is never enough. She touches me while I sleep. Her hands are so cold, like touching the sea itself. I tried to make her leave. She laughed, said the lighthouse is hers now, said she has been waiting for someone to invite her in. What does that mean? What have I done? The final entry, dated March 14th, was barely legible. She is not a woman. She is something that wears a woman's shape. I have seen her true form in the darkness. I have seen what she is. God help me, I let it in. I invited it across the threshold. The old stories are true. The selkies, the marrows, the things that wait in the deep water for drowning men, they are real. She has been feeding on me. Not just my blood, my life, my soul. I am hollow, I am empty. Tonight I will end this. Tonight I will. The writing stopped. The remaining pages had been torn out. Madness, Constable Doyle said, but his voice wavered. The isolation drove him mad. He imagined a woman, hurt himself in his delusions, and finally, he gestured at the body. But Dr. Morrison was examining Thomas Wickham's remains more closely. He took the dead man's crippled hand, studying the mutilated fingers. Then he looked up at the others, his face grave. These bite marks, he said slowly. The pattern of the teeth, they're not human. The jaw structure is wrong. The spacing of the incisors, the depth of the canines. This is not from any person. Then what? Hutchins demanded. I don't know. Perhaps a large dog or... There are no dogs up here, Sullivan interrupted. Wickham didn't keep animals, never has. Michael O'Malley had been silent throughout. But now he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The old stories. My grandmother used to tell them. Things that come from the water, things that pretend to be human. They can't enter a home uninvited, she said, but once you invite them in... Fairy stories, Doyle said sharply. Superstition. This is 1874, not the Dark Ages. Then explain the wounds, Morrison challenged. Explain the writing. Explain why a man who kept this lighthouse perfectly for 11 years suddenly descended into this horror. They couldn't. They stood in silence, surrounded by the evidence of something that had no rational explanation, something that made even educated men remember the stories their grandmothers had told, the warnings about what lived in the deep places, and the old compact between the human world and the other world, that men ignored at their peril. It was Hutchins who finally noticed what was missing. The woman, he said. If there was a woman, real or imagined, where is she? Where is the body? They searched. Every room of the lighthouse, every corner of the keeper's cottage, the rocks below the tower, the entire perimeter. They found nothing. No second body. No evidence that anyone besides Thomas Wickham had been present. But they did find one thing that made them all stop breathing for a moment. On the cottage doorstep, perfectly preserved in the morning dew, was a footprint. Bare, female, with webbing between the toes, investigation aftermath. The Board of Irish Lights moved quickly to contain the situation. Within 24 hours of the discovery, an official inquiry had been convened in Dublin. Within 48, The preliminary report was written, signed, and filed away in archives where it would remain undisturbed for over a century. The official conclusion: Thomas Wickham had died of injuries sustained in an accidental fall while maintaining the lighthouse lamp. The wounds on his body were attributed to scavenging gulls that had entered the lamp room after his death. The writing on the walls was evidence of mental deterioration brought on by isolation, alcoholism, and untreated grief over his wife's death 7 years prior. The journal entries referencing M were dismissed as fantasy, the delusions of a lonely man who had invented a companion to ease his solitude. The footprint was never mentioned in the official report. Dr. Henry Morrison objected strenuously to these findings. In a letter to the board dated March 25, 1874, he wrote, "I must protest in the strongest terms the characterization of Mr. Wickham's death as accidental. The wounds I observed are inconsistent with any fall, and no seabird possesses the jaw strength necessary to inflict injuries of such severity. Furthermore, the condition of the body indicates these wounds were inflicted ante-mortem, not post-mortem as the official report suggests. To attribute this to animal scavenging is not merely incorrect, it is a deliberate falsification of the medical evidence." His objections were noted and ignored. Dr. Morrison was quietly informed that further protest would result in the loss of his contract with the board. He had been the physician for lighthouse keepers along the Dublin coast for 15 years. He had a family to support. He said nothing more publicly. But privately, he continued to investigate. Through contacts in the fishing community, Morrison learned that the storm of January 27th, the one that had supposedly driven M ashore, had indeed sunk a vessel. The Mary Catherine, a trading brig out of Liverpool, had gone down with all hands approximately 15 miles northeast of Howth. 8 souls lost, including one woman, Mary Kathleen Doherty, wife of the first mate, who had been traveling with her husband against regulation. Morrison obtained descriptions of Mrs. Doherty from her family in Liverpool. She had been 26 years old, auburn-haired, and by all accounts beautiful. She had also been 3 months pregnant. No body matching her description had ever been recovered from the wreck. Morrison died in 1889 without ever publicly connecting these facts to the Howth Lighthouse case. But in his personal papers, donated to Trinity College Dublin after his death, researchers found a folder labeled Wickham, Unresolved. Inside were newspaper clippings about the Mary Catherine, transcriptions of his interviews with the fishing families, and a single sheet of paper on which he had written, "If we accept that something came ashore at Howth in January 1874, we must also accept that it was not Mary Kathleen Doherty. Something wore her shape. Something used her form to gain entry to Thomas Wickham's lighthouse. The old Irish lore speaks of creatures that can assume human appearance, kelpies, selkies, the marrow. All share common traits. They come from water. They are bound by invitation laws, and they feed on human life force. Wickham invited it in. That was his fatal mistake. But what became of it afterward? Where did it go when he died? Is it still out there, waiting in the cold water, watching for the next lonely keeper to offer shelter?" The question was not merely academic. Between 1874 and 1920, 7 lighthouse keepers along the Irish coast died under circumstances officially labeled as accidental, but bearing disturbing similarities to Thomas Wickham's death. All were men who kept isolated lights. All were found in their lamp rooms. All bore wounds attributed to falls or animal scavenging. And in 3 cases, fellow keepers or visiting inspectors reported seeing a woman near the lighthouse shortly before the death, a woman who, when questioned, could not be found. The pattern was noted by a junior inspector named Colin Macready in 1921. He compiled a report suggesting that someone or something was specifically targeting lighthouse keepers. His report was filed and forgotten. Macready resigned from the board shortly afterward. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, "They don't want to know the truth. They can't afford to know it. If word got out that there was something genuinely dangerous preying on keepers who would staff the lights, how would they maintain the system? Better to call it accident, call it madness, call it anything but what it truly is. But I have seen the files, Timothy. I have read the reports they thought they'd buried. Something is hunting our men, something that comes from the water and knows how to exploit their loneliness. I want no part of it anymore." The Howth Lighthouse itself was automated in 1952. The keeper's cottage was demolished in 1968. The tower still stands, its lamp now controlled by electricity and timers, requiring no human presence. Modern sailors rely on it without knowing its history, but the local fishing families remember. They tell their children not to invite strangers in from the sea, no matter how human they appear. They warn about the things that wait in the deep water, patient and hungry, watching the lights that burn above the waves. In 1982, during renovations to modernize the remaining lighthouse equipment, workers discovered something sealed behind a panel in the lamp room. It was a cloth bundle containing bones, small bones, delicate, not quite human in their proportions. Also in the bundle was a lock of auburn hair and a piece of paper with a single sentence written in Thomas Wickham's hand. She was pregnant. The thing inside her was not human. God forgive me for what I've done. This discovery was not reported to any official body. The foreman who found it, a man named Declan O'Brien, quietly buried the contents at sea and told his crew to speak of it to no one. When asked years later why he'd done this, O'Brien said simply, "Some things are better left buried. Some truths serve no purpose but to terrify. Let the dead rest. Let the living forget." But forgetting is not the same as being forgotten. In 2015, a marine biology researcher named Dr. Sarah Hennessy was conducting a study on seal populations around Howth when she captured something unusual on her underwater cameras. The footage, recorded at a depth of approximately 60 feet near the lighthouse point, shows what appears to be a human figure swimming with impossible grace and speed. The figure is female in form but moves in ways that defy human biomechanics. At one point, it turns toward the camera, and for just 3 frames, less than 1/10 of a second, something that might be a face is visible. Dr. Hennessy submitted the footage to her department at University College Dublin. It was reviewed, discussed in a single meeting, and then classified as anomalous, camera malfunction suspected. She was encouraged to focus her research on other areas of the coast. The footage was never released publicly, but Dr. Hennessy kept a copy. In an interview conducted for a documentary about Irish folklore in 2019, she said, "I'm a scientist. I believe in evidence, in empirical data, in explanations that can be tested and verified. But I also believe my eyes. What I saw on that recording was not a seal. It was not a diver. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of biology. But the sea is vast and deep, and we've explored less than 5% of it. Who's to say what might live in the other 95%? Who's to say what might come to shore on dark nights, looking for lights and warmth and the company of lonely people?" Broader implications. The Howth Lighthouse case raises questions that extend far beyond one keeper's death in 1874. It forces us to examine the intersection of isolation, folklore, and the limits of rational explanation. Lighthouse keeping was, by its nature, an occupation that attracted or created a certain type of person. These were men, and occasionally women, who could tolerate extreme isolation, who could maintain absolute reliability in their duties while seeing no other human being for weeks or months at a time. They lived in liminal spaces, on the boundaries between land and sea, between civilization and wilderness. Psychologists now recognize that prolonged isolation can produce profound effects on the human mind. Sensory deprivation, lack of social interaction, and the constant sound of wind and waves can trigger hallucinations, paranoia, and dissociative episodes. The phenomenon is well documented among Antarctic researchers, solo sailors, and yes, lighthouse keepers. But does that explain Thomas Wickham? Dr. Robert Fitzgerald, a psychiatrist specializing in isolation psychology, reviewed the Wickham case in 2008 as part of a larger study on occupational mental health in the 19th century. His conclusion was cautious but troubling. While isolation-induced psychosis could explain some elements of Wickham's behavior and the content of his writings, it cannot account for several key aspects of the case. The physical evidence, the nature of his wounds, the missing person he described, the footprint, suggests something more complex than simple hallucination. Either we're looking at an elaborate hoax perpetrated by Wickham himself before his death, which seems unlikely given his exemplary service record and the severity of his injuries, or we must consider that something genuinely anomalous occurred at Howth in 1874.